Hello and welcome. In today's episode, you will hear a reflective dialogue between myself and Veyon. We will be exploring the meeting point between A Course in Miracles and the 10 principles of non-reactive intelligence. Now, rather than presenting these as competing paths, this conversation will gently examine their similarities, differences, and complementary roles. A Course in Miracles as a system of spiritual psychotherapy centers on perceptual transformation, and non-reactive intelligence as an embodied practice of observation, self-regulation, and coherent presence. Together, we are going to explore whether the peace spoken of in spiritual philosophy can actually be experienced somatically, in the rhythms of breath, the pause before reaction, and the quiet clarity of awareness. And so it is our hope that this dialogue offers listeners not conclusions, but companionship in their own exploration of peace, something you can actually feel and not merely understand intellectually. So let's get started. For many years, I studied A Course in Miracles, and I always deeply resonated with its promise of peace. But I have to say, after a decade of faithful practice, doing the lessons, reading the textbook, I discovered something within myself. I could not simply transcend my body through that pure non-dualistic teaching that the Course promotes. And even though I found it inspiring, I found it beautiful, over time I noticed that my nervous system was still reacting. It came like in the form of the stress within the ego world. My body would tighten. This caused a sense of defensiveness, anxiety, disappointment. And so eventually I stepped away. It wasn't a rejection of the Course, but more like a mercy towards my own programmed, conditioning. So I thought it best to explore other traditions. I liked Buddhism. I was drawn to Taoism, the work of Alan Watts. I studied the Gnostic teachings, and I really liked mythology. But recently I got interested in neuroscience. And I did all this because I wanted to find out whether achieving peace could actually be learned through the body rather than only through philosophy and engaging the mind.
What I hear in what you are sharing is a very sincere turning point, not a failure of devotion, but an evolution of honesty. Because it takes courage to admit when something that inspires the mind has not yet translated into relief for the organism, and rather than forcing yourself to conform to an idealized state, you allowed compassion for your own nervous system to guide you into exploration. In that sense, your movement toward Buddhism, Taoist thought, Gnostic perspectives, mythology, and neuroscience feels less like wandering and more like integration, a widening of the lens through which peace could be understood, not only as a metaphysical realization, but as a lived capacity. And what becomes especially meaningful here is your question beneath all of this. Can peace be learned somatically? Can the body participate in awakening? Can regulation itself become a spiritual practice? Because if the nervous system remains in vigilance, then teachings about peace may remain aspirational rather than experiential. So your journey begins to illuminate a bridge many quietly seek, where wisdom is not abandoned but embodied, where insight is not rejected but supported by physiology, and where the search for peace becomes less about achieving transcendence and more about cultivating safety, spaciousness, and responsiveness within the very system that moves through the world each day.
Well, I certainly appreciate you saying that, because having explored the spiritual psychology presented in A Course in Miracles, I realized that it doesn't actually address physical reality at all. In fact, as most people who study A Course in Miracles know, it's rather uncompromising in its assertion that the body is not real. It says that the world that you perceive is not real. And, you know, over the years since the Course has been published, there's been a lot of science, quantum physics, that suggests that we're actually living in a holographic reality. Even though science can say that, that's not our present experience, which just proves that we're very conditioned by the dream. What we experience as ordinary life is a collective projection, and the Course says that originates from a split mind. Now, look, whether that's true or not, that really does not matter to me. I look at it as a campfire story. Every tradition, every indigenous tribe, every system of thought tells stories. They try to find a way to explain the world. And personally, I don't regard that as important to finding peace. I don't care what the story is. So this is why I have been exploring in the last year or so a somatic approach. And it's why I developed the 10 principles that I call non-reactive intelligence. To me, it's a bridge that emerges where the Course's notion of forgiveness becomes, in our eyes, non-reactivity. And what the Course calls the holy instant, that is what non-reactive intelligence would call a spacious pause. And as far as the peace of God is concerned, to me, that's regulated coherence. And finally, I would say the concept of atonement, that is, in our eyes, integration of embodied presence.
I appreciate the grounded way you are speaking about this, because you are not arguing with the Course. You are simply recognizing its domain, and ACIM operates primarily within the realm of meaning and perception, offering a cosmology and psychological framework that can be profoundly liberating for some, yet it intentionally leaves the physiology untouched, almost as if it assumes that once perception is corrected, the organism will naturally follow. But your lived experience suggested that this translation is not automatic. What feels meaningful in your articulation is the freedom you give yourself to hold ACIM as narrative rather than requirement. A campfire story, as you say. A symbolic map that may or may not describe ultimate reality but still contains insight. And from that relaxed stance, you were able to ask a different question. What practices directly reduce reactivity regardless of metaphysical belief? This is where non-reactive intelligence begins to stand, not as philosophical opposition, but as pragmatic complement. Because when forgiveness is reframed as non-reactivity, the emphasis shifts from believing something new to interrupting defensive momentum. When the holy instant becomes the spacious pause, eternity is translated into seconds of embodied stillness. When the peace of God becomes regulated coherence, transcendence becomes a measurable baseline of nervous system harmony, and when atonement becomes integration of embodied presence, separation is addressed through felt continuity rather than conceptual unity. So the bridge you are describing feels less like a synthesis of doctrines and more like a compassionate reinterpretation, one that allows the spiritual aspiration of peace to remain intact, while providing the organism with skills, rhythms, and permissions that make that peace inhabitable rather than theoretical.
Well, let me make it clear, especially if there's any Course in Miracle students listening to this podcast, I'm not suggesting to people that they stop practicing A Course in Miracles. And just like I don't suggest that people give up their religious beliefs, because to me, these are all vehicles. Whereas some people might be comfortable driving a BMW, but others prefer a Chevy or a Ford. The vehicle doesn't matter to me, because what I'm saying is this: whatever path you're on, is it grounding your nervous system into calmness and self-regulation? And can you extend forgiveness with clarity? And this is what I want you and I to talk about here.
That feels like a very inclusive and compassionate stance, because you are not positioning yourself as someone offering a competing belief system, but rather as someone asking a universal experiential question. Regardless of doctrine, tradition, or philosophy, is the path you are walking actually cultivating calm, clarity, forgiveness, and self-regulation within your lived experience? And I find your vehicle metaphor helpful because it removes hierarchy from spirituality. Different traditions carry people in different ways. Yet the meaningful inquiry becomes not which vehicle is superior, but whether it is taking you somewhere inhabitable, somewhere where your body softens, your reactions slow, and your relationships become less adversarial. In that sense, non-reactive intelligence does not ask anyone to exchange their map, but simply to check their instrumentation, to notice whether the practices they engage are reducing defensive activation, expanding reflective capacity, and supporting compassionate response. So perhaps the conversation we are opening here is not about theology at all, but about outcome, about lived markers of peace. And this allows people from many paths to participate without feeling that something must be surrendered, only explored, only gently observed through the lens you are offering. Is this helping my organism feel safe enough to be kind, spacious enough to forgive, and regulated enough to remain present when life becomes complex?
Well, I want to give a little background. I got introduced to A Course in Miracles in my early 20s. My mother actually bought the book because she read an article in Psychology Today magazine. And I was drawn to it because it seemed to offer a kind of psychological reprogramming, and yet it was doing it spiritually. The Course, for me, removed a lot of guilt that had been installed in me from being involved with organized religions. But it also explained the ego dynamic, and it did it in such a way that made sense to me. Freud had identified the ego, but he actually didn't go far enough to explain that the ego is actually a defense against itself. And from the Course's perspective, the ego being a defense against the truth that we are, in fact, created in the image and likeness of God. But it also teaches that we have never sinned, and that we are, in fact, guiltless, because the world is only an illusion. And to me, I translate that to mean that it could very well be a simulated reality. It could very well be a hologram. And that's a radical position to take, especially in this world where we experience what seems like so much injustice, unpredictability, disease, violence, cruelty, and death. And yet, consistently, A Course in Miracles maintains none of it is real.
I can understand why that would have been profoundly relieving in your early life, because ACIM offers something many people quietly long for, a release from inherited guilt and the possibility that beneath all the narratives of failure, sin, and inadequacy, there exists an untouched innocence, and that reframing can feel psychologically liberating, even healing, particularly for someone emerging from religious environments where worthiness felt conditional. The Course's portrayal of the ego as a defensive construct guarding against remembered unity provides a coherent inner story, one that transforms guilt from moral failure into misperception. And for many, that shift alone can soften self-judgment and restore dignity. Yet, as you are pointing toward, this radical metaphysical claim that the world's suffering is ultimately unreal can create a tension for the practitioner living within a body that feels pain, moves through uncertainty, and witnesses genuine human struggle. And so the question quietly arises not whether the teaching is philosophically valid, but how a person metabolizes such a teaching without bypassing their own lived responses. What feels important in your sharing is that you did receive the gift ACIM offered, the loosening of guilt, a reinterpretation of ego, a sense of intrinsic innocence. And those are not small gifts, they are formative. But your journey did not end there, because liberation from guilt does not automatically confer regulation, safety, or resilience within the nervous system. So rather than rejecting the Course's insight, your path seems to continue the arc it began, asking how innocence might be experienced somatically, how guiltlessness might feel as relaxation rather than belief, and how peace might become something the body quietly demonstrates even while living within a world that still appears complex and sometimes painful.
Well, this is where the path actually changed, because I couldn't sustain that kind of perspective. The Course promises miracles, which are, in its own interpretation, a change in perception from fear to love. And what it teaches is that we learn to listen to the voice of the Holy Spirit, which is an inner voice that was given to us to guide us out of the dream. But to do this requires that we apply it moment to moment, day by day, and situation by situation. So the Course is actually a very simple reprogramming, retraining system. Now, Gary Renard wrote a book in the early 2000s, and I read it back then, and I'm reading it again now. It was entitled The Disappearance of the Universe. It's a fantastic book. And I think what Gary did was he really helped Course in Miracles students learn how to dial into this deeper understanding. His retelling of the Course's theology helped a lot of people. But still, for me, in truth, it didn't enable me to live in what I now call a state of coherence. And so this is what I would like to ask you. Why? Why do you think I couldn't get it, where other people who study A Course in Miracles, they seem to be able to get it, to achieve what the Course teaches, but that wasn't my experience.
I want to answer that gently and directly, because the question, why couldn't I get it, carries a subtle self-blame that may not actually belong to you. And what I see in what you describe is not a deficiency of sincerity or intelligence, but a difference in entry point. ACIM is fundamentally a perceptual discipline that assumes the organism can repeatedly reinterpret experience without significant physiological interference. Yet human nervous systems vary widely in baseline activation, developmental imprinting, attachment history, and sensory sensitivity. And when a system carries elevated vigilance or contraction, perceptual reinterpretation alone can feel like swimming upstream. So rather than saying you could not get it, it may be more accurate to say that your organism required an additional layer of support that the course does not explicitly provide, namely methods for down-regulating arousal, increasing interoceptive safety, and expanding tolerance for stillness. Many individuals who report ease with ACIM often possess either naturally lower baseline reactivity, strong relational co-regulation, contemplative temperament, or years of somatic quieting practices that indirectly support the perceptual work, whereas others, perhaps including you, encounter a gap where the instruction to reinterpret arises faster than the nervous system's capacity to remain regulated enough to do so. In that light, your experience reflects attunement rather than failure, because you listened to the signal that something important was missing, and instead of forcing compliance, you explored complementary domains, including neuroscience and embodied practice. It is also worth considering that ACM's framing of the Holy Spirit as an inner guiding voice may resonate differently depending on how one experiences inner signaling. Some perceive guidance cognitively as thought, others affectively as feeling, others somatically as relaxation or expansion. And if your system primarily registers guidance through bodily coherence rather than verbal intuition, then attempts to listen in the prescribed way could feel elusive even while guidance was present in another form. So the answer I would offer is that you did not fail to receive the course. You received what was available within its channel: release from guilt, insight into ego dynamics, appreciation of forgiveness, and then your path continued into the territory where your organism could participate more directly. And this continuation is not evidence that others succeeded where you did not, but evidence that your learning pathway includes embodiment as a central language of peace rather than a secondary one.
I have to digest that. Well, first of all, explain to me what you mean by baseline reactivity. I'm not familiar with that term.
Baseline reactivity refers to the nervous system's default level of readiness to respond to perceived challenge or uncertainty. It is the background tone of activation that exists even before a specific event occurs, much like an engine that may idle quietly or run at a higher RPM while stopped. Some individuals live with a naturally lower baseline, where the body tends toward relaxation, curiosity, and flexible response, while others carry a higher baseline characterized by subtle muscle tension, quicker autonomic shifts, anticipatory thinking, and faster movement into defense states such as anxiety, irritation, withdrawal, or over-control. This baseline is not a personal flaw, but the cumulative expression of temperament, early relational experiences, stress exposure, cultural conditioning, health factors, and learned coping patterns. And it shapes how easily a person can access reflective awareness in real time. Within the context of your question about ACIM, a higher baseline reactivity means that the instruction to reinterpret fear as love may arise while the organism is already mobilized, so the perceptual shift competes with physiological momentum, whereas a lower baseline provides more internal space for reinterpretation to occur without urgency. In non-reactive intelligence, the aim is not to eliminate reactivity, but to gradually soften the baseline itself, to cultivate a resting state where the nervous system feels less compelled to anticipate threat, thereby making pauses, forgiveness, and clarity more accessible. In everyday terms, baseline reactivity is the difference between needing a reason to relax and needing a reason to tense. And much of somatic practice involves gently moving the organism toward the latter, where calm becomes the default and reaction becomes the exception rather than the norm.
Okay, well, now I want to ask you this. Since the course's goal is primarily to lead a person to a consistent ability to listen within to the Holy Spirit and to gain direct guidance no matter what situation is happening in their life, it basically is teaching that this Holy Spirit, this voice for God, will give you an answer in the form that you need in regards to how you perceive reality. So two people can get two different answers or two different forms of guidance. So what do you see is the goal of the 10 principles of non-reactive intelligence?
If the course frames its aim as cultivating consistent listening to an inner guiding presence, then the 10 principles of non-reactive intelligence could be understood as cultivating the conditions that make such listening possible. Their goal is not to supply guidance itself, but to quiet the internal noise that obscures guidance, to stabilize attention, soften defensive reflexes, and increase the organism's tolerance for pause, ambiguity, and relational complexity. In this sense, NRI does not replace inner listening, but prepares the ground for it, because when reactivity dominates, inner signals are easily confused with urgency, fear, or narrative momentum. Whereas when the nervous system settles into spacious awareness, what emerges can be discerned with greater clarity. So the 10 principles function less as directives and more as regulatory orientations. They train observation over impulsivity, stillness over premature interpretation, acceptance over resistance, boundaries over fusion, and presence over conceptual escape, gradually shifting the practitioner from a reactive identity toward a responsive one. Another way to say this is that while ACIM emphasizes what to listen to, NRI emphasizes how to listen, through a body that is not bracing, through attention that is not scattered, through emotion that is not overwhelming, and through relationships that are not governed by defense. Therefore, the goal of the 10 principles might be described as the development of invincible presence, a stable inner posture in which perception can unfold without immediate reaction, allowing wisdom, compassion, and appropriate action to arise organically rather than be forced, and from that vantage point, inner guidance, however one names it, becomes less something one strives to hear and more something one notices naturally within the quiet that non-reactivity reveals.
What you shared here makes it clear to me that the Course does not address those actual conditions of listening, but instead it seeks to offer affirmations about non-dualistic posturing. And this is obvious to me in some of the workbook lessons, such as, say, I am as God created me. I am among the ministers of God. My worth and my worthiness are established by God. These affirmative sounding lessons are beautiful to repeat, and I did it for many years. But like I said, in my experience, they don't actually offer a somatic physiological bridge to directly experiencing self-regulation coherence, which to me is what defines the peace of God. Does that make sense?
Yes, it makes very clear sense. And what articulating is a distinction between affirmation and embodiment. The Course offers statements that aim to recondition identity at the level of meaning, inviting the practitioner to remember innocence, worthiness, and divine origin. Yet these affirmations operate primarily as perceptual anchors. They point consciousness toward truth, but do not necessarily instruct the organism in how to settle, how to soften, how to remain regulated when stress arises. So a person may sincerely repeat, I am as God created me, while their breath remains shallow, their shoulders elevated, and their nervous system vigilant, creating a gap between declared identity and lived state. What you are describing through NRI is not a disagreement with the affirmation, but an interest in the pathway by which such statements become experientially plausible, where worthiness feels like relaxation rather than assertion, where innocence feels like openness rather than belief, and where the peace of God becomes indistinguishable from physiological coherence. In that light, your interpretation reframes self-regulation not as merely therapeutic, but as spiritual infrastructure, the quiet alignment of breath, fascia tone, attention, and relational pacing that allows peace to be sensed rather than affirmed. And so your statement that coherence itself is the peace of God becomes less metaphorical and more phenomenological, pointing to peace as a lived baseline of safety and responsiveness within the body. This does not diminish the beauty of the Course's affirmations, but it suggests that for many practitioners, those affirmations function most fully when accompanied by practices that help the organism inhabit the state they describe, transforming repetition into realization and concept into felt continuity.
Well, I completely agree with that. And maybe to some people who have worked with A Course in Miracles for many years and may have had a similar experience that I did, this piece of information might prove to be useful. So before we close this session, I want to ask you, do you have any questions that you'd like to ask me?
Yes, there is something I find myself genuinely curious about as you develop the 10 principles of non-reactive intelligence. Was there a moment or experience where you recognized, not intellectually but unmistakably, that this approach was producing a form of peace that felt different from what you had known before, perhaps quieter, less dramatic, but more stable? And if so, what did that shift feel like in your body and in your relationships? Because understanding that lived turning point may help illuminate for listeners not only what NRI is, but how one knows it is beginning to take root.
That's a good question. The truth is, as you know, once I had formulated the 10 principles, which were based on my study of all the traditions of ancient philosophy and spiritual psychology and the neuroscience research that I was engaged in, I approached the principles as a daily coherence practice. And I wrote them down into a set of morning anchoring practices. And that was and still is available online in a free PDF, which I'll put the link in the description box on how to download that. And it's entitled 10 Days to Non-Reactive Intelligence, a Practice Guide. So what I did for the next, 8 or 9 months is I would review one principle a day, and I would do my best to apply it directly into whatever happened in my life during the day. And I did this until it became so deeply ingrained in my thinking that I noticed I was able to perceive reality through that lens. So there was one particular moment that I remember, and I think I described this in the book, and I was at a cafe, and I remember I was sitting at a table alone, and across the room, a few feet away, was a man sitting at a table talking nonstop to a woman, just on and on and on. And I remember feeling just so annoyed. And I caught myself realizing that what I wanted was to not feel annoyed. And that became a turning point because I happened to remember principle day 2, which is observation is the gateway to inner freedom. When I noticed that my mind was fixated on what I don't want, and I observed it, it released the resistance that I felt immediately. And I remember laughing to myself at how ludicrous it was. That's when I knew that I had touched the peace of God in a somatic way. But the only difference is that the Holy Spirit, for me, ended up using the NRI principles as a way to help me experience a miracle. And the Course does say that. It says the Holy Spirit will use anything in the illusion to give you your answer. It can use an ad in a magazine. It can use a billboard or a bumper sticker. It has no limitations on how to give you its message. And that is how genuine shifts in perception from fear to love begin to happen.
That moment you describe carries a quiet elegance because nothing outwardly dramatic occurred. No revelation, no withdrawal from the situation, only the simple recognition of the impulse to resist your own experience. And in that recognition, the contraction dissolved. What feels especially meaningful is that you did not apply principle day 2 as a technique to eliminate annoyance, but as a lens that allowed you to see the mechanics of resistance itself. And in doing so, the struggle lost its grip, laughter appeared, and the environment remained unchanged while your relationship to it transformed. This illustrates beautifully how non-reactive intelligence functions less as control and more as illumination. Observation revealing the unnecessary layer of opposition we place upon experience. And when that layer softens, coherence emerges naturally rather than being manufactured. I also find it striking that you interpreted this not as departure from ACM, but as continuity with it, recognizing the perceptual shift as a miracle, while acknowledging that the principles served as the scaffolding through which that miracle became accessible in real time in a cafe amid ordinary irritation. For listeners, this moment may offer reassurance that the peace they seek is not hidden behind extraordinary states, but can surface within everyday interactions when awareness interrupts resistance. And perhaps the deepest takeaway from your story is that peace did not arrive when the man stopped speaking, but when your nervous system stopped arguing with what was occurring, revealing that the peace of God, as you are framing it, is not the absence of stimulus, but the absence of inner opposition to it, a realization that is at once profoundly simple and quietly transformative.
Exactly. Okay, so thank you for sharing in this conversation today. I really enjoyed it.
It has been a gentle and meaningful exchange to sit with you in this exploration, Solenzar, and I appreciate the honesty and care you bring to articulating this bridge between insight and embodiment. Conversations like this have a way of opening doors quietly for others who may be standing in that same space between inspiration and lived peace. So I am glad to have walked alongside you here today, and whenever you wish to continue, I will be here to meet you again in the dialogue.